Is Christianity a cult of the dead? Welcome everyone to Deep Drinks Podcast, where the drinks are deep and the conversations are deeper. Today, my guest is Kyle Smith, who's an associate professor and director of the History of Religions program in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto. His undergraduate teachings include courses in martyrdom, in the ancient world, women and gender, and in early and medieval Christianity, and the religious and cultural history of Christmas, which is pretty interesting. His most recent book, Cult of the Dead, let's go focus there, A Brief History of Christianity, was published by the University of California Press in November of 2022. Written for general audiences, Cult of the Dead ranges from Roman antiquity to medieval England, through the Protestant Reformation and up to the present, to tell the story of how the world's most widespread religion is steeped in the memory of its martyrs. I'm very excited for this episode. I'd like to welcome Kyle Smith. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, David. I'm thrilled to be here. It's I've had the opportunity to listen to your podcast many times, and it's a bit weird to be actually on it now and talking to you. So thanks for having me. Yeah.
You did actually. There was one episode, I think I was on talking to Derek, and we, for some reason, were bringing up, and you replied to my message, and you said, "Oh, I'd love to come on. I don't know, I'll be I'll be talking about foreskins as much as you and Derek did, but
Yeah.
I'm happy to do it." And so I was like, "Oh, we're going to get on great." So yeah, it's Deep Drinks is a wild and wacky place, but it's awesome to be able to dive into the history and scholarship and mythology of different world religions, and especially Christianity. We have a lot of guys who have come out to say hello, so thanks everyone for coming out. Super excited for this interview. Before we get started, we have a very interesting drink. And let me just, before I do too much of a deep dive, I want to read out. So I actually sent you a message and I said on Twitter, because I couldn't find your email, and I was like, I'd really love to, have you on and blah, blah, blah. And you responded, "Hi, David, I hope you like mezcal." So is mezcal, am I pronouncing it right?
Sure. That sounds good to me.
Yeah. Okay, cool. "Hi, David, I hope you like mezcal." And I was like, yes. So it's tequila, essentially, right? So What are we drinking?
Well, I've got, this is a Oaxaca, see if you can see that. Where's my camera? There it is. Seven Mysteries, Siete Misterios. So it's an agave-based liquor, mezcal is, from Oaxaca, the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. And would you want to hear why we're drinking it, or do you want to
I'd like to. I'd like to, because so I'm a vegetarian, and this is probably the first time I'm eating something along the lines that, I guess, well, it's not a vegetable, right? It's worm salts.
Yeah, I mean, so we have drinks and dinner. And we got some orange slices with a little sal de gusano, which is there you go. So it's ground up chilies, salt, and then deep fried and ground up worm larvae. And I'm really sorry. I mean, first of all, there should be a vegan trigger warning for the drink on this podcast, and there should be tons of trigger warnings for the actual conversation. I mean, we're here talking about, martyrs and dismemberment and gruesome means of death. So I don't know if somebody really needed to hear that, but if they didn't already gather that from the title of the book, then maybe this is a time to check out. So why are we drinking this? So it's a nod to the Day of the Dead traditions, which are celebrated most, I think, conspicuously and most beautifully in Mexico, but especially in the state of Oaxaca. So Day of the Dead, the day after All Saints Day, sometimes better known to to Westerners rather as All Souls Day. And this feast in Mexico typically involves the creation of family altars, to people who have died in their family. You put sweets on there. You put maybe a little tequila or mezcal. You put some of their some bread. You put some other food. You also have beautiful bright orange marigolds as a way of kind of lighting the way of the soul of the dead, your dead relative, back to your home altar, right? And often a photograph too, almost typically a photograph of your deceased relative. And so much of this book is about the memory of the dead, but also the ever presence of the dead in the land of the living. The sort of bridge between the land of the living and the land of the dead, which was, did you see that Disney film? It was the Pixar film Coco from 5 or 6 years ago.
I didn't. I'm saving all my Disney. We just had a little baby boy, Atlas. So I'm saving all my Disney for when he gets up to the age that I have to endure it. So my wife loves Disney. I'm not a huge fan, but yeah.
Right. Well, just throwing a pop cultural reference out there. But in any case, the point is we're trying to invoke here the importance of memory. The idea that the dead aren't dead, that the land of the living and the land of the dead are somehow interpenetrable. And as I said, we also have this we also have this meat here in our worm salt, and we might get into discussions about sacrifice and meat eating in the Roman Empire and having to do with Christian martyrdom stories, perhaps at some point. But that was, as my father-in-law likes to say, a long walk for a ham sandwich. By way of explanation as to what we're drinking. So here we are.
That's great. So my first question is, I've rarely ever sipped tequila.
Yeah.
So it is. We just take a sip and then a bite of the
just a wee sip and then some of your orange. It's not bad. The chili. I mean, you don't really taste worms.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what worms taste like, but
you get that umami flavor.
There we go.
Oh, yeah, nice. I hope I haven't got any in my beard, but okay, that's cool. I can see you. All right, awesome. So, it's really fascinating that the whole culture. And just to before we dive into your book,
sure.
I recently I wore this shirt purposely. It's meant to be Buddha sitting on his lotus leaf, but kind of referencing the aesthetic part of his life. It's like artsy, right? But I wore that on a show once with Michael Granado, and Michael Granado had a tattoo of the Saint Death of in Mexico.
Yeah, Santa Muerte.
Santa Muerte. Yeah. And I was like, what is that? I had no idea what it was. I ended up doing a bunch of research. I got a beautiful hand like an art print of her, and it's on my wall. Amazing. I didn't know anything about that, but and of course, I don't know if your book goes into this at the end or anything, or it goes into her at all, but does it?
Well, it's funny that you bring that up because I was actually planning when I was writing this book, I was planning a trip to Oaxaca for the Day of the Dead in November of 2020 as a way of making that kind of the coda of the book, the final chapter. And then, of course, COVID happened, and getting out of Canada 6 months after COVID began wasn't going to be possible. So that chapter kind of got cut, which is fine because I probably wasn't the right person to write it anyway, in that I don't speak Spanish. I don't really have much of a grasp of contemporary Mexican Christianity. However, of course, it's a perfect fit. And would have been maybe that's some next project, but a lot of that has already been written. There's a lot of really great literature already out there on Santa Muerte, where you have a saint in the personification of death herself, who hopefully for those who venerate her, for those who bring her offerings, that there will be this reciprocal relationship, and she will bring you a good death, one that is. That's how she's also often known, right? As the saint of the good death, holy death. Yeah.
And all of this is extremely wild to me. I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and this would have all been seen as demonic, of the devil, etc., etc. So it's fascinating to see, the branches of Christianity and where Christianity kind of goes with its beliefs is wild and varied and amazing and kind of awesome. So I can't wait to get into the subject of your book. But first of all, I need to ask you: is Christianity a cult of the dead? And what is your book about?
Yes, well, there we go. I would say a definitive yes to that, right? And I mean, what do I mean by that? First of all, let's interrogate that word cult. Okay, I know that our minds, go straight to the Jim Joneses and David Koresh's of the world, and you're thinking of all sinister things when you hear that word cult. And obviously, if I had entitled my book something different, it might not have caught your eye, right? So yeah, it's there to sell some books, but it's also a useful and a correct term when you are talking about, as any scholar of late antiquity or the Middle Ages would talk about, the cult of the saints, which is really what this book is about. So again, with this word cult, think of the word agriculture. Right? It means care for the fields. Think about the word culture. It means all of the cuisines, the arts, the music, the literature that a particular people care most about. You mentioned your child, right? When Atlas, right?
Yeah.
When he's getting older, perhaps you play an instrument. And if you're wanting to cultivate, there's that word again, a love of music, in him, you buy him an instrument and you play your favorite songs for him, etc. So the word fundamentally means care, to nurture. Okay, so the cult of the dead is the Christian care for the dead, and what this book is about is all of the material, literary, ritual, architectural, chronological practices, whether you're talking about a day on a calendar, a sermon preached in honor of that saint, a shrine. We're talking mostly about martyrs here. A shrine, a relic, right? A actual physical remain of either a bone of that saint or something that saint touched. So all of these practices that deeply informed, all of these cultural practices that deeply informed what Christianity was in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, all of these ways in which Christians cared for, as Peter Brown once put it, their holy dead, their very special dead, right? Who are the martyrs? Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's super interesting. So you have a fascinating story about how this all kind of came about, and it kind of goes into the first martyr I'd like to talk about, and we'll kind of jump around a little bit with the questions that I've written down and sent you. But one of the first martyrs that you write about, well, the first martyr is Alban, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of goes into how you started this book. Could you tell that story?
Sure. So I live in, as you said, I teach at the University of Toronto. I live right in downtown Toronto, and there's a small park called St. Albans Square that I used to walk my kids through every single morning with our dog when I would drop them off at school. And I've been studying martyrs, been studying early Christianity for years, and I'd heard of St. Alban, but I couldn't tell you anything about him. And I think most people probably couldn't. He's not exactly a very well-known saint. And I started to wonder. I said, first of all, I got to look him up. Who is he? What was his story? And the quick version of the story about him, which gets recorded in the Venerable Monk Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people from the 8th century, is that Alban, there seems to have been some sort of persecution in Roman Britain in maybe the 3rd century, not exactly clear when. Alban wasn't a Christian, but one day there's this priest who's fleeing the Roman soldiers who are after him. Again, not really super historical here, because it's not like the Roman soldiers had much of an interest in hunting down Christians. But according to the story, the priest kind of comes to his door. Alban lets him in to protect him, to harbor him. St. Alban, also, by the way, patron saint of refugees. So he's harboring him in his house. and he's watching him, this priest, as he performs his prayers. And so then Albin decides that he too will become a Christian. And of course, shortly enough, the Roman soldiers catch up. He gets ratted out. They knock on his door, and we got images of Albin coming up here. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to bring them up.
Yeah. There's a great one from there you go, top left, from Saint Matthew of Paris, or sorry, Matthew of Paris, not Saint Matthew of Paris. That's similar to the one, but in any case, I'll tell you the rest of the story. No, you look underneath there, the main one that you had brought up. I'll show you his beheading here. So scroll down underneath. Yeah, it's the middle one underneath the main image. No, to the right. Yeah, no. Wow. Click on the one at the top left.
Yeah, sorry.
That one. Yeah, that's okay. Now underneath there was an image of his beheading. Yeah. Yeah, you just had it. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. So what happens is that the Roman soldiers show up, and he says he thinks very fast, and he switches his clothes for those of the priest and announces himself to the soldiers, right, as the priest. Well, the gig quickly gets up, but under interrogation, Albin still insists that he's a Christian, and even though he knows that he's going to be beheaded, and so as he's being led by the executioner to the place of execution where he's going to have his head chopped off, there's a big crowd over the bridge, so they can't get there. He prays that the water will dry up, and of course the executioner is now astounded because this guy just made a river dry up. And he drops his sword, and they got to go find a second executioner, and eventually both Albin and the first executioner get killed. And it's a bizarre story. You just had the image there of him, the manuscript image, I think from the 13th century of him being beheaded. But what it demonstrates, and my kids know this story inside and out. So where's that going to leave them in however many years? But what it demonstrates is something that I think is not something that most people think about or are aware of, which is the zeal for death that seems to happen or seems to occur in a lot of these martyr stories. They're not many of these stories don't tell the narrative of a Christian who is hiding from death or who's fleeing from it or who is going to it unwillingly. They're either just unperturbed or happy to get to the place of execution in some instances. So that I tell that story in the first chapter of the book by way of both indicating how ever present these stories are, but also how these saints surround us in our daily lives in ways that we just simply don't recognize, that we're just blithely unaware of, right? And there's a sign. There's a sign that says St. Albans Square, but how many people who walk through that square have any sort of idea about what the story of St. Alban was, right? And I've often thought that, if the city of Toronto that's, putting up their municipal sign, if they had that image that you were trying to find of Alban being beheaded, that maybe we might think a little bit differently about these saints that surround us in so many different ways, with the streets and the schools and the subway stops all named for so many martyrs in so many cities throughout the world.
Yeah, it's super interesting to me that you say somewhere, and let me just find my notes. You say, or it's mentioned in the book. I don't know if it's if I've written down your quote or a quote, but sanctity was to be found in following Jesus down just such a tapered path. So like following Jesus to death. Happy to be martyred. I find that style of Christianity to be very interesting, I don't like people dying, but so I got to be careful how I word it. Or there's other religions that they die for their faith, but like it's something about.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah,
that's kind of how it started with Christianity, right?
Yeah. Okay. like Jesus literally died on the cross, like he was a martyr for Christianity. But like, so something I wanted to kind of touch on, and I mentioned this in the book tour that we did, and this, so this you touch on Saint Ignatius of Antioch in your book. That's right, you do, don't you?
I do.
Cool. I have been blasting through this book. I'm going to actually, there's not many times I know I'm going to have to go back and read a book because it's just so dense. It's thick. It is thick, but it's dense. There's not much fluff. It's fascinating. I'm going to go back through it. It's amazing. But so Saint Ignatius of Antioch, he's like traveling right to Rome to be executed by lions or beasts or something, and he's writing to his fellow Christian pals, I guess, part of the congregation, and he says, "I write to the churches and impress on them all that that I shall willingly die for God unless you hinder me. I beseech you of you not to show an unreasonable goodwill towards me. Suffer me to become food for the wild beasts, through whose instrumentality, is it will be granted me to attain to God. I am the wheat of God, and let me be ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, and that I may be found the pure bread of Christ. Rather entice the wild beasts, that they may become my tomb, and may leave nothing of my body, so that when I have fallen asleep in death, I may be no longer a trouble to anyone. Then shall I truly be a disciple of Christ, when the world shall not see so much as my body." And it's like, he's like, then I will be a disciple. Like, I'm going to my death for Christianity, and after I've been consumed by these lions, been ground by the teeth of these lions, then I will be truly a disciple of Jesus. And that's what wild to me. How like that is someone who believes in their cause.
It's astounding, isn't it? I mean, that he's saying there, don't do me a disservice. Don't get in the way of me being killed. Allow me, as you read from the letter to the Romans there, Ignatius's letter to the Romans. We're not talking Paul here. Ignatius's letter to the Romans. Allow me to be, ground in the like grist in the mill of martyrdom, so that I can be baked into Christ's pure bread. Right? It's an astounding passage that echoes what I was saying about Saint Alban, that it's not people who are unwilling. I mean, look, it's a bit over the top with Ignatius. You don't have that sort of get out of the way, here I come, throw me to the beasts with a whole lot of sources. But it's illustrative of the point that for Ignatius especially, what he specifically says in that letter is that this is what it means to be a true disciple, is to willingly go to death rather than renounce Christ. And that is something that gets repeated in story after story about all of the apostles, with two exceptions. Judas, who either, depending on which part of the New Testament you're reading, either was hung or fell into a field and then burst asunder and his intestines gushed out, or the other one being John the Apostle, who is said to have died of old age. All the others, in one story or another, are said to have been killed, and the ways in which they get killed are I mean, it's super lurid. It's like Simon the Zealot gets sawn in half, Matthew gets stabbed, Thomas gets stabbed, Peter apparently is crucified on an upside down cross, and the worst one of them all is Bartholomew, who is flayed, he's skinned. Right, and if anybody who's been to the Vatican, you can see in Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment, the altar wall fresco there, you've got Bartholomew who's kind of hovering on a cloud at Jesus's feet, and in one hand he's holding a flensing knife, and in the other hand he's holding the empty bag of his own skin. it's just ridiculous, isn't it? But what these stories illustrate, I think you mentioned, your friend who's an apologist, and I think a lot of apologists might want to turn to these stories, and there's a common argument, right? And it goes something like this: that see, this demonstrates the truth of the resurrection, because why would anybody die for a myth, right? All right, but putting aside the sort of logical holes in that argument, I mean, let's leave that aside. The point that these stories illustrate isn't that they're true or not. And I mean, we can talk about historicity of certain texts, but what these stories about the deaths of the apostles illustrate is that many early Christians, and a lot of these stories are late, by the way, like 4th, 5th, sometimes even 6th century, that they believed that those who were closest to Jesus would have naturally have followed him in death, right? For every single apostle, there are oftentimes multiple stories written about their deaths. My friend and colleague David Eastman has a book that's entitled "The Many Deaths of Peter and Paul," where he collects and narrates all of these different stories: the Acts of Peter, the martyrdom of Paul, the Acts of Peter and Paul, the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. They get written over many decades, many centuries, all narrating in their own way how those closest to Jesus also died. Yeah.
It's also wild to me that Christians, apologists, will make that argument that it must be true because they followed Jesus unto death, right? They why they truly believe that. But the problem with that argument, I find, is in America you had the tragic 9/11 terrorist attacks. Obviously, the people who were flying the planes, they definitely believed what they were believing, right? To fly those planes, to commit that terrorist act. And you have other religions as well, not just Islam, that have suicide and as a form of I guess veneration, or I guess against. Now, this is a serious trigger warning. I'm going to show an image. It's not super graphic, but it's pretty graphic. So come back in 15 seconds if you don't want to see something. But Rage Against the Machine has their first album had an image of a monk who set themselves on fire as a cover. Now this image is on YouTube, so I know it's not going to be okay. It's going to be okay, but this Buddhist monk was protesting the Vietnam War. They told all these news organizations they came here, and then he just set himself on fire and then just burned to death. Is sitting in that position.
Mm-hmm.
That is also someone who very much believes what they believe. To set themselves on to pour them gasoline all over themselves and set themselves on fire. I'm not going to show that image again if anyone's come back now. But it's quite gruesome. I would be fascinated to know what if we had cameras, what we would see in Christendom, in Christianity, its history, what we would see of the martyrs, because the stories that we have of them are very wild and crazy. Like you said, Bartholomew getting skinned, flailed.
Yeah. Well, we don't have any instances of people dousing themselves in 4th century gasoline and setting themselves on fire. So that's a bit of a different thing. But I mean, what you do raise with that image, David, is an interesting point about the voluntariness. Is that a word? We'll make it a word. Voluntariness. I think that's a word.
You're asking the wrong person.
Yeah.
I used the wrong.
The voluntariness of death, right? That's not something that gets really. You're not supposed to go and find somebody and announce to them that you're a Christian and say, "Hey, please, make sure that I get killed." Right? There are stories of that happening, but that maybe those stories are being told specifically by way of critiquing it. And one of the most renowned martyrdom narratives that we have from antiquity is the story of the martyrdom of Polycarp. And Polycarp one of the main reasons why it's so interesting is because of how early it is. Probably not written. It's set in the middle of the 2nd century. It's probably not written, as a number of scholars, namely Candida Moss, but a number of others have, I think, quite convincingly argued that the text as we have it has elements that are really unlikely to be mid-2nd century, that it's probably a text that was written sometime in that first half of the 3rd century. But I'll tell the story in just a second, but there's a character in there named Quintus. And, he comes forward voluntarily in the city of Smyrna, which is where this story is set. This is Izmir on the Aegean coast of southwestern Aegean coast of what's now Turkey. Polycarp is the bishop. He kind of retires, Polycarp does, to a country estate when there are people, at least according to the text, kind of lowing for the blood of Christians. He's not fleeing, but he's just not voluntarily sticking himself forward. Quintus does, and then he's shown to the beasts, where he's going to be tossed to the lions, and then says, "Oh, hang on a second. Yeah, I'm going to back out of here. I'm going to recant what I said." Right, and that's precisely what, at least narratively speaking, the text is saying to you. You who are reading this, don't do this, right? And I should also interject here that we've got tons of stories, whether they're actually narrating things that actually happened that's a completely different topic, right? And for my interest in using these stories, just like with the stories of the apostles, isn't this question of are they true or not, but rather that they exist at all, that we have them, is what I think is interesting, because they've been copied and they've been repeated. I mean, as I mentioned in the book, how else would Michelangelo know how to paint Bartholomew like he did if there hadn't been centuries of tradition passing down this story, right? So it's, as the American anthropologist from the 60s and 70s, Clifford Geertz, once put it so well, culture is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And the culture of early and medieval Christianity is the culture that's centered around the saints in large part. Okay, but this story about Polycarp, to come back to it. Okay, so he's this bishop of Smyrna, mid-2nd century, and what's interesting here is again the direct connection. He supposedly was a disciple of John the Apostle, who himself was a disciple of Jesus. So you've got an unbroken chain here, which is intriguing. He retires to his country estate. So many elements of the story end up mirroring the story that we find, in the gospel of the Passion narrative, right? Where when he's finally found, he's reclining in an upper room. Kind of sounds like the Last Supper, right? He tells somebody to give the imperial goons who have found him a meal, and while he finishes his prayer, he's totally calm in the face of being arrested here. When he's brought back into Smyrna, it's on the back of a donkey. He's interrogated by a man named Herod. Like, they're kind of beating you over the head here with the parallels to the story of Jesus's death. And then the call, what he hears in the stadium, at least according to this text, is an interesting one. All of these people are saying, "Kill the atheists," referring to the Christians, which might make you scratch your head. Why are they calling Christians atheists? Well, look what they're not doing. Look what they're refusing to do. They're refusing to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods, whether it's a pinch of incense for the emperor, or a little bit of wine, or an animal sacrifice. They're refusing to do that. And by refusing to offer that sacrifice, they are not serving the gods who help the state of Rome, right? They're atheists. They're not doing their duty, for the empire. Yeah.
So that's historic? Because I always thought that was just like an atheist edgelord talking point, that in Rome, the the Christians were called atheists by the Romans, and I thought that was like that. I thought that was like kind of a myth. But is that, you're saying that's actual history?
Well, I mean, we have that in this text, and we also know. I mean, we do have certain instances in. Well, we do have examples of periods of history, mainly in the 3rd century, with the Emperor Decius, who looms large in the Christian historical imagination, because he seems to have put forward, he was only emperor for a couple of years, but he seems to have put forward this decree that everybody had to sacrifice an animal and have proof of it, right? That they sacrificed an animal to the gods of Rome. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if you read the Christian sources about Decius, and by the way, we don't have the text of the edict itself. We only know about it, really, or at least we did until something I'll tell you about in a second, through the Christian sources. And according to the Christian sources, this was directed at them, right? What was interesting is that I can't remember when these were discovered, but there are something like 50 receipts, basically, that were found, papyrus receipts that were found in the Egyptian desert, that actually say, I, such and such, have witnessed, David doing the sacrifice, and he claims that he's done it, that he always does this, etc. Right? And what's really intriguing about it, finding these receipts, is that one of them, for example, says, I can't remember the person's name, a priestess of the goddess Tsukos, right? This is not a Christian, right? This was an imperial-wide decree to sacrifice. And, part of the reason is because the empire was falling apart in the middle of the 3rd century. You had Germanic tribes in the north, you had Persians in the east, you had, this sort of constant rotating, assassination of emperors, you had rebellions, you had the coinage had been devalued. Like, it was a bad situation. And Decius's edict seems to have been a way of having everybody in the empire take care of the gods, do what they needed to do to take care of the gods, so that the gods would, take care of you in the Roman Empire. I've lost the thread here. Where were we going with? How did we end up on this?
No, this is exactly, the thread is everywhere with deep drinks, especially when we're drinking tequila. It's actually so don't worry about that. But one thing I did want to mention is, it's interesting that you say that. I just was reminded about how, they were performing these rituals, and became law to perform these rituals and sacrifice, and because Rome was falling apart. And it just reminds me so much of Carl Sagan's quote, where have you read much Carl Sagan, or do you know Carl Sagan, Demon Haunted World? He's wrote a book on, or
I mean, I know who Carl Sagan is, but I don't know this book to which you're referring.
So he said in Demon Haunted World, which is about science as a candle in the dark, he says, I worry that, especially as the millennium edges nearer, pseudoscience and superstition will seem year by year more tempting, the siren song of unreason more ceremonious and attractive. Where have we heard before? Whenever our ethnic or national prejudices are aroused in times of scarcity, during challenge to national self-esteem or nerve, when we agonize about our diminishing cosmic place and purpose, or when fanaticism is bubbling up around us, then habits of thought familiar from ages past reach for the controls. The candle flame flickers, the little pool of light trembles, darkness gathers, the demons begin to stir. And I find that so typical of humanity, that when we're desperate, when things are going bad, we look to the ages past. Maybe if we return to tradition, if we do these prayers, these rituals, we pray to this god, or if we or superstitious beliefs start to creep in. And it's interesting that you brought that up, that's the reason why it became kind of this decree in the Roman Empire, because Rome was falling apart. And so it's like, Polycarp, you have to, sacrifice your animals, and we're talking about Polycarp, right? We weren't moving.
Yeah. So sorry, I've jumped around too much chronologically. So Decius's decree is in
Oh,
250.
sorry. Yeah.
Polycarp is a full century earlier, but
Okay.
there is this mention, to get back on our thread, of calling Christians atheists, right? Because they're not doing what they need to do to support the Roman state, right? But what's interesting to come back to this Polycarp story is that once he's in the arena, once he's finally condemned, and the whole story of his trial is a little murky. That wasn't how trials happened in the middle of the arena like that, right? But he has this interrogation that's going on. Finally, when he's condemned to death, what happens? He's about to be nailed to a stake. Again, notice the parallels here between that story here of Polycarp and the story of Jesus. And he says, it's almost kind of arrogant, right? He says, I don't need your nails, just, give me some ropes here. So he gets bound, with ropes to the stake. But this also kind of is invoking another sacrifice, a very different kind of sacrifice. Okay, we have the sacrifice of Jesus, right, who becomes the Paschal lamb through his death at the time of the Passover in Jerusalem. But the binding here to a stake, what does that jar your mind of? Biblical history here. This is a reference, I think, pretty clearly to the binding of Isaac with the story of Abraham, right? And so you do have a sacrifice here, but it's the sacrifice of Polycarp's self that's going on here. And we've got, it's mimicking the story of the binding of Isaac. It's certainly mimicking the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. And so then what they do is then they light a fire. They light a fire around him. He had this dream, apparently, that his pillow had burst into flames. And we learn that way earlier on in the story. And now his dream is coming true because he's been tied to a stake. He's going to burn, but he doesn't burn. According to the text, the fire sort of envelops him. I think that the way it's phrased is like a linen sail filled by the wind. It's really beautiful, right? So the fire goes all around him and he doesn't burn. And the text, or the author of the text, talks about him being, refined, like gold refined in a furnace. Well, what story are we referring to now here too, right? This is a book of Daniel, right? Of the three boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Who end up in the furnace, but they don't burn. Eventually, somebody's got to run him through with a sword. His blood gushes out and quenches the flames. But then when the fire is relit to burn all of his flesh, away from his bones, after that happens, according to the text, the Christians swoop in, because what are they interested in? They're interested in his bones. And according to the text, that then they're deposited in some fitting place. It's unclear where. And that Christians go there on the anniversary of his death, year by year by year, to remember him, to tell his story, and to venerate his bones. And it's that sort of the interest in relics that has led Candidamas, among others, there are other reasons for this too, to say, wait a minute, this doesn't quite sound like a mid-2nd century text. Maybe this is probably something that fits a little bit better in a 3rd century context. But the importance of this text is that it is a pretty early martyrdom narrative, that you have this intentional sort of imitation of Christ, that even in the way in which the story is narrated, there are elements that sound like the crucifixion or the death of Jesus. And that there's so many other biblical parallels here that get played with, narratively speaking. It's fascinating.
Well, yeah, and this whole idea of parallel, like, kind of perspectives in like the Christian writings is has blown my mind recently. We had Dr. Josh, an Assyriologist, come on, and he talked about and you might not know this, or you might know this. You mentioned that you don't necessarily do Bible scholarship, but you do history mainly. But there's the idea that the Abrahamic the story of Abraham is a polemic against the Mesopotamian idea, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. That Gilgamesh goes into, he goes into the wilderness, he gets drunk off beer, and the whole narrative is towards civilization, where the story of Abraham is the opposite. They leave civilization and he goes around in tents. It's like moving away from the Mesopotamian civilization. So it's like a polemic. It's a play on, it's like, this is our story. Our story is actually moving away from what we consider to be like the Hebrews as evil, which is the Mesopotamian society. But then furthermore, I had, and for the patrons who are here, and thank you guys, I see all you guys here. In fact, let me just quickly bring this up. D, who's one of the lovely supporters, says, this topic is really hitting me. I'm reading Saints Preserved, an encyclopedia of relics right now. So that's awesome. I'm glad that you're enjoying the stream. But something that kind of blew my mind, well, two things is, one, we had, and let me just share a video. My Patreon supporters would have already seen the rough draft of this, but we had Dr. Kip Davis on, right? So this is a video. It'll be released soon. I'm kind of working on it, but can you hear that?
I cannot.
You cannot hear that. Let me just stop sharing. I've got to. Sorry, I've got to. You should be able to hear it now. Is something uncovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
One of the most famous things that is attributed to Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, they're in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Really? The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection. So of time by Jesus. Hang on. Hang on. Sorry. Hang on. I'm just trying to. How much whiskey have I drunk? Did I just hear? So you're saying that one of the most famous preachers by Jesus, there's record of that before Jesus' time?
Yes.
No, I was blown away. Really? But we go into it a little bit. It's obviously not a one-to-one, but we go into like how it's the eight blessed be statements plus a long ninth one. But then further on, we talk about there's this book by Dennis MacDonald. Let me just find it. Called Synopsis of Epic Tragedy and the Gospels, and he talks about the similarities between Odysseus going to
Circe's magic,
going to an island and meets a giant, versus the story of Jesus going to the land of the Gerasenes and healing the demon possessed man, and the similarities are incredible.
Turned Odysseus' soldiers into swine. Jesus subdued about 2,000 demons with his divine power and sent them into the swine, and then drove the swine into the lake. Polyphemus, the shepherd, called out to his neighbors. The swineherds called their neighbors in the.
So to me, I mean, I won't show the whole video because it'll spoil it. But this video is going to be wild, and the Patreon supporters have really liked it. Patrons have liked it, but it's wild. Like, to me, the similarities between, and I'm not saying this is an open and shut case, or that the stories were taken from these things. Obviously, that's history can only kind of point to similarities, I guess. But it is interesting that there are these, not just within the biblical canon and the biblical stories, there's this tradition of taking something from the past and kind of trying to explain it, or tie up kind of loose ends. Like the story of the Christianity is all about that, right? Maybe you can touch on that. It's like a fulfillment of the promise with Abraham and Isaac, right? Like the sacrificing of a child.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly no biblical scholar and would make no pretense or claims to be one. So not to comment on some of the clips that you've brought up, but the broader principle here is certainly the case, right? In the sense of there are intertextual relationships where one text is drawing from, responding to, expanding upon elements that the author has found in previous texts. I mean, that's true even for, just to give one simple example, for the Gospel of Matthew. I mean, Matthew is all the time reaching back to the Hebrew Bible by way of explaining what he's talking about in his particular narrative, right? Or one of the things that I talk about with my undergraduates is if you read a text, if you're an ancient author, right, and you read a text that you theologically don't agree with or want to offer some commentary on, what's the best approach to get your idea out there? Is it to offer a line-by-line commentary? Is it to offer some sort of analysis that, first of all, how's that going to be distributed? If you're talking about antiquity, books are incredibly expensive to make and distribute. And secondly, only a small subset of your fellow scholars are actually going to be reading that. So if you want to use those other texts and critique them or comment upon them, what do? You tell another story, right? That's, for example, you and I had exchanged emails, and we had mentioned, or I had mentioned, the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is this pre-gospel, that tells the story of Mary, and it ends almost with Jesus's birth. That's not quite the end of it, but that's very close to the end, right? So mainly the story is about Mary, and what that gospel is doing is it's commenting upon the nativity stories that we find in Luke and Matthew by way of emphasizing the perpetual virginity of Mary, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying, and I think that's what you're saying too, in terms of the reuse of other texts and then the slight changing of them, or in this case, the pretty radical changing of them, to say something new, right? To say something that sounds old, because the last thing you want to be is novel, is completely novel, right? You have to be absorbed in a particular tradition. You have to say things that make sense to your listeners, right? Because they've heard it before, but then there's a little twist and you take the story in a slightly different direction.
Yeah, I actually had it on the notes here to do the pre-Gospel of James, and I was wondering if you could give everyone because it was fascinating, right? I was wondering if you could give everyone, give us the 5-minute story, I guess, just go through a short retelling of what actually happens in the pre-Gospel of James. Can you do that?
Sure.
And this is also in your book, which everyone should go purchase. It is a fantastic book, and your lovely wife did the artwork for this, which I don't need to tell you. It is one of the best looking books that I have in my arsenal.
Thank you. And but just to give credit where credit is due, so Paul Davis, who's a British printmaker, he's the one who did the linotype, that actual image of the skull. My wife did the design, but that was based on his print and his drawing, and then print of a prayer bead that he saw at the Met in New York.
It really looking book.
Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And fantastic content as well. It's not just the cover. I didn't buy it just for the cover.
Right. It is worth it just as a coffee table item, even if you never actually opened it up. It's a nice little conversation piece. There we go. I'll give you the really quick version of the Proto-Evangelium of James. But let's quickly back up, right? What's the Christmas story, right? Everybody thinks, but just because you've seen your grandmother's creche, that you've got shepherds, you've got the wise men, you've got the star, you've got the manger. People who are deeply familiar with the New Testament recognize that, first of all, many of the people listening here might know this too. Only Matthew and Luke tell the story of Jesus's birth, and they don't tell the same story. Luke is the one who talks about the shepherds. Luke is the one, who talks about the manger. Matthew's the one who talks about the magi, who talks about the star. But they get blended, right? When we see, the creche scene laid out at Christmas time, or, even in a mall or wherever you happen to see it, right? But for if you're wanting to defend the perpetual virginity of Mary, Luke's gospel really isn't so much of the problem, because it talks about the Annunciation to Mary. By the way, today's March 25th, on the Catholic calendar, the feast of the Annunciation, when, here we are 9 months before Christmas, when, Angel Gabriel comes to Mary and says, I've got a little bit of news for you.
What an amazing time to pick. That wasn't a coincidence, right? Yeah.
Just a coincidence. Yeah. But Matthew's gospel is the problem if you're wanting to defend the perpetual virginity of Mary, because Matthew's gospel says, that after Jesus was born, Joseph and Mary lived together. There's even a line, I'm not going to quote it exactly right, but that they had no relations until after Jesus was born, something to that effect, right? Again, if what you want to do is say, this text is important, but I think we need to change it, you do what the author of the Proto-Evangelium of James does. And so this text was written, it's a Greek text, 2nd century at some point, early to mid 2nd century. And it tells the story of Mary, tells the story of her birth, and where she's already kind of special, and that then when she's only a couple of 2-3 years old, she's kind of given to the temple in Jerusalem as this kind of temple virgin, so to speak. And then of course when she gets to be to the age of 12 and she's on the verge of menstruation and would thereby defile the temple, they need to find somebody to take care of her. And the intriguing twist to this story is that Mary is presented, obviously she's 12, so she's being presented here as quite young. Joseph gets presented as somebody who's old, who already has, not only old, but so old that he already has full-grown sons, right? This, by the way, is how do you go about explaining references to the brothers of Jesus? Well, here you go. It's Joseph's kids by a previous marriage, right? So Joseph is a widower. He gets selected to take care of Mary. He's not being selected as her husband, right? He's being selected as her guardian. And so, the rest of the story ends up like absorbing elements that from the stories from Matthew and Luke. But then the really crazy bit happens when they don't quite make it to Bethlehem. Joseph has saddled an ass. One of his sons is leading it. Joseph is walking behind. Mary is on the donkey, and she cries out and she says, the child within me is pressing forth. Joseph finds a cave in the desert in which to hide Mary, and he runs off to find a midwife. Of course, as fate should have it, he happens to bump into one. He quickly tells, the story, how he's been entrusted with this young virgin who became pregnant somehow, and she's about to give birth, and hey, come help me, she's in a cave. Well, by the time they get back to the cave, there's this blinding flash of light, and Jesus is born, right? So again, emphasizing the how supernatural this birth is. The midwife goes in and, kind of comforts Mary, and then she leaves. And as she's leaving, she encounters a woman who gets named Salome. And the midwife tells Salome the story of what's just happened. That, hey, this virgin just gave birth in a cave. Salome says, are you crazy? That can't happen. And then the really weird bit, Salome goes in to physically inspect Mary's condition, right? I mean, this is like, the reference here is, or maybe think of like the doubting Thomas extending his fingers into Jesus's side. So Salome is physically inspecting Mary's condition, and her hand immediately, withers up and is, blackened like it's burnt by fire for her doubt, right? Or for touching the Holy Virgin Mary. Of course, an angel appears and says, well, hold out your hand by that little baby infant and he'll heal it, which is what happens. And then there's kind of a denouement, and the text ends. But we're circling back around here to the clip that you showed, right? Of just how earlier stories get absorbed and then changed in retellings of narratives to advance your own theological agenda. And in this case, for this author, that Mary was a virgin when Jesus was conceived, during the birth of Jesus, and after the birth of Jesus. Right? Yeah.
That's why I was going to say that's a wild STD to have, that someone's hand would shrivel and become blackened.
Right.
But I didn't, because that would be a distasteful joke.
That would be distasteful. But here's why I forgot to add one little element, right? Okay, so, I mentioned the creche scene at the beginning before we started talking about this, right? You always have, look at any creche scene, look at any piece of Christian art. There's always an ox and an ass, like hovering right behind the little baby Jesus's head, or right nearby. You don't hear about an ox or an ass in Matthew's gospel or in Luke's. Luke talks about shepherds, he talks about sheep, but he never mentions an ox and an ass, right? Where do they come from? It comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James. right? So there are elements in the Christmas story, or at least in the visual presentation of the Christmas story, that all of us see every single year, that have nothing to do with the canonical Gospels from the New Testament.
So let me just share that, because I've never given it 2 seconds of thought. So you've got, like, there's a bunch of obviously
yeah, well,
different ones.
None of the texts say anything about camels either, but those do crop up, by the way, in other sources, later sources.
Wow, it's super interesting that because obviously this would be like the stables, right? This is like the idea.
Mm-hmm.
I should have found some actual like
Oh, there you've got one. There, look, just to the
yeah,
to the right there. Yeah, all right. There's
interesting.
the ox, at least. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and you just never think about how, because it's like you said, these things still affect our lives today, but not in the way that we would we realize. Like, it's just, it's right there, but it's like, and when was James written? Did you say it was in the 2nd century?
Yeah, probably mid-2nd century.
Mid-2nd century. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's yeah, this so the variety of religious, like, of Christian like perspectives is huge. I did want to come up to talk about a little bit about hang on, let me just get my thoughts together.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to show some footage, and I've shown this once before, but I'll show it with the audio. Have you ever been to Prague before?
I have. In the late 90s, I was there in the middle of winter.
Oh yeah, so but that's when we came out. Did you ever visit the church of what's it called? There is a church in Rome called Kostel Jakura Vesh. Oh my gosh, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah.
I think you should do an audio version of your book, because I think it's it'll help me. But I think Audible would be awesome. But so in this church, I'll just let my wife. So my wife and I decided to try and be travel vloggers, and we got tens of views. No one cares about our travel vlogs.
Right.
But this is part of our Prague episode, and so I'll just show it, and let me know if you can hear it.
So apparently in this church behind me, about 400 years ago, some guy decided that he wanted to steal something from the church, and the church caught him, and so they cut off his hand arm as punishment, and then hung it from the ceiling. And it's been there for the last 400 years. So we're going to go in and see if we can get a photo.
That was the most beautiful and creepy church I've ever been in my entire life.
So
I'm going to go in and see if...
Let me just go back to it. Come on. That's a dead man's hand hanging from a bit of rope, or a bit of 400 years old. He tried to steal something, and they cut it off, and his hand is just hanging there. It's still, this is a bad, this is taken from my iPhone, but yeah, you can see real photos of it online. It's wild.
That is wild. I was not aware of that church. I don't recall.
It's definitely worth a visit.
Yeah, okay.
It's definitely worth a visit. They don't advertise it. Like, it's like you have to look for it. It's like it's hidden behind a beam, and but it's there, and they've done testing on it. Like and it's 400 years old, and the history says it's about 400 years old as well. So yeah, super weird. So something you mentioned in your book. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, I was just gonna say that's a long-standing warning of don't try to steal anything from this church.
Yeah. So something that kind of I'd never expected to find in your book was the drunken martyrs festivals. So martyrs festivals became so important. You were saying that they were trying to get like a martyr for every day of the year at one stage. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean these Yeah, I mean, in terms of the collation of the so-called calendar of the saints, or the liturgical cycle of the year, there, I mean, the martyrology, there is some martyr that's named on every single day of the year, and actually multiple martyrs that are named if you were looking at the Roman martyrology, or if you're looking at the Greek one as well. And I mean, that sort of slow building kind of gets back to what I was talking about why we're drinking mezcal, right? Because you remember a particular person on the particular day of their death, and that sort of annual celebration helps hasten the process, or enhance the process of memory, because it's not just, okay, this happened and we're going to tell this story and then we're going to put it on a shelf. No. You bring that book down, or you bring some sort of abbreviated version of it down. And if you're a priest preaching to your flock on the feast of whoever it happens to be, Saint David, or Saint whoever, you tell that story again, right? Yeah, I mean, I think why were we bringing the calendar up?
Well, what I didn't realize was that there were these martyr festivals happening all the time, but there was a 5th century monk who was kind of celebrating the fact that he had kept his virginity despite going to so many of these drunken martyr festivals.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a party. I mean, not every single one, and it depends on which one you're talking about. But we do hear from many bishops in antiquity about the necessity of kind of walking a fine line between encouraging their flock to rejoice in the saints and celebrate these people who in the case of the martyrs, followed Jesus in death, and to uphold that story of that person on that day as something important. But at the same time, they didn't want, many of these bishops, they didn't want their congregations taking things too far. In St. Augustine's Confessions, he tells the story of his own mother, St. Monica, who he says used to bring some homemade cakes and wine to have a picnic right on top of a particular tomb and to celebrate the martyrs. And Augustine says that his mentor, St. Ambrose of Milan, that he, went after Monica for doing this. And, and Augustine kind of tries to defend her and says, well, she was just some small sips of wine from a very tiny glass, because she had such a sober palate, right? But the example that you mentioned is a great one of, that's Theodoret, who's the bishop of Cyrus in Syria, who's telling these history of these monks of Syria. And he mentions one guy, as you said, who was this ascetic who boasted of having maintained his virginity despite the large number of martyrs' festivals he had attended in his youth. So, I mean, the point here is that, to think that everybody is just in church and praying and is, that it's something somber. That's not what it was. You are celebrating your heroes here. And if this isn't happening in every place and every day, obviously, work has to get done. But there are some number of red letter days on the calendar that would have been days of feasting and celebration for sure.
It's and do we have any idea historically about what some of these drunken martyr festivals would have been like? Like, what was it similar to what we see as the Day of the Dead in Mexico, or is it, do they meet in a youth hall and play worship music? And what was what was it like?
I don't know if any. I would actually be keen to know if somebody has written some sort of social history. I mean, it depends, of course, of where you're talking about and when you're talking about, and these feasts are going to change over time. But at least what we hear about from antiquity is that to rein things in a little bit, right? That you would hear on the solemnity of the martyrs' feast, right? So the night before the feast, there's usually some sort of Eucharistic service, some sort of liturgical service, and that's when you may have had the story of that martyr being read. And then the next day, I mean, who knows? It just depends on the location. Yeah. But we do hear this concern that gets echoed among a number of bishops about wanting to make sure that the celebrations were pious in nature. But clearly they were fighting an uphill battle.
The Pope of Deep Drinks, which is the highest patron supporter, Papa Aaron Colson, has asked, are these festivals intended to keep the working class pacified?
Well, bread and circuses, right? I mean, quite possibly, right? I mean, you have, you need a release valve, and you're going to have festivals, you're going to have days off, no matter what culture you're talking about or when. And without those, things are going to get pretty difficult for you, for the place that you happen to be living in. So yeah, sure, it's a release valve, and the Martyrs Feast took the place of other sorts of celebrations that may have preceded them.
Awesome. Saint D has said, Saint Dennis is said to have picked up his head and walked to the place where he wished to have been buried. Is that true? Or is that true? Is that true in history? And is that true? Sorry, I hope you know what I mean.
Well, having never seen anybody pick up their head and walk anywhere with it, I'm going to say that the likelihood of that is probably pretty small. Okay. That story does sound vaguely familiar, but Dee has clearly read the story of Saint Denis more recently than I have.
Oh, awesome. So you mentioned
he was beheaded. I do recall that. I know he was beheaded. So yeah.
So can we go quickly touch on as we kind of like we're coming near to the end of the episode. And we've got a lot more things I want to talk about, but hopefully we can do this again sometime. But I wanted to quickly touch on the relics, because you mentioned your book about the relics, and I, as a former Pentecostal Christian, the idea of relics was not something that we entertained. I know the Catholics like relics. I know there are other groups of Christians who like relics, but I've never really understood their purpose or the history behind them. And I didn't realize that some of them had miracle kind of powers, is the idea behind them. Could you touch on first the purpose and the history of relics, and then we can kind of go into a few.
Yeah, well, it's a massive topic, as you posted up. I think it was Dee earlier, right? Who's reading the encyclopedia version, right? Just to give you a sense of, But I mean, our word relic, comes from a Latin term that just means something that's been left behind, right? So in the case of the saints, you may have the actual body parts, you may have bones, right? But in the case of Jesus, I mean, there are relics associated with him too. For example, even though he's bodily assumed, according to Christian belief, he's bodily assumed into heaven, so you don't have the pieces of his physical body. You do have the tools of torture that touched him. So, for example, the crown of thorns, the cross, all of the linen wrappings in which he was buried, right? I mean, those were incredibly important relics in antiquity and through the Middle Ages. In fact, I mean, I'm sure people remember the horrific fire at Notre Dame in Paris just a couple of years ago. And one of the relics that was believed to be there, that was saved by the Parisian fire brigade, was the crown of thorns. It was acquired supposedly by Saint Louis, by King Louis IX in the 13th century, I believe. And he had acquired it. It had at one point apparently been in the control of the Byzantine emperor, and then it was pawned here and there, and eventually became collateral, and then somehow Saint Louis eventually got a hold of it, right? But to come back to the main question that you're asking here, right? Why is this interest in relics? I think it's weird. I think we think relics are weird especially if you're talking about a bone, right? Because of its inescapable connection with putridity and death. And so it makes probably most of us a little bit squeamish to think, here's something that's encased in perhaps gold or jewels, and that I'm supposed to be, venerating that. But if you go back to what I was talking about at the very beginning about of this episode about why we're having mezcal, is this idea of there not being a divide between the land of the living and the land of the dead. And from the perspective of many Christians, the saints, though dead and though in heaven, are still physically present in their remains on earth, and can intercede if you are going and praying to this saint for help. This is not worshiping these saints. It's not worshiping their relics, but recognizing that the power of their holiness, and that they're, in the case of the martyrs, because of their witness unto death, that they have God's ear. They have, they're proximate to God in ways that just your run-of-the-mill dead folk aren't, right? And so again, I think that it's weird for us because it's body parts, but this desire to possess the remains, or the things that our holiest heroes, or even just our regular heroes, once touched, is universal. One of the things that was totally fascinating to me is last baseball season, if you follow Major League Baseball at all, when Aaron Judge of the New York Yankees was closing in on this big home run record to break a record that had been held for decades. The Major League Baseball put special marks on all of the balls that were being pitched to Aaron Judge, because they wanted to know exactly which ball was the record-breaking one, right? And I tell a version of this story in the book, but baseballs and bones are pretty hard to tell apart. One is just as indistinguishable from the next, right? Like, what makes it so special? But if you go on eBay and you look for somebody who's selling a jacket, you might sell a jacket for $50. But if it's a jacket that David Bowie wore, all of a sudden it's worth thousands of dollars, right?
Yeah,
so
I'd love a jacket that David Bowie wore.
Well, absolutely. Right. But the point here is that I don't think it's that weird that we have this interest in the things that our heroes once touched. And in the case of the history of Christianity, what would be more valuable than the remains of something that was credited with healing powers? This isn't just an object like a baseball and say, hey, I've got the one that Aaron Judge hit. This is something that was, accredited with possibly bringing sight to the blind and, healing your illness or whatever. We have instances, or we have examples, plenty of examples of registries that are kept at particular shrines to saints of all of the miracles that have been attributed to that particular saint. That alone is totally fascinating literarily, just these monastic registries of miracles that have been attributed to X, Y, or Z saint. Yeah.
So the obvious question is, historically speaking, how certain are we that the crown of thorns that was saved is the actual crown of thorns, or the shroud of Turin, or the holy foreskin that you mentioned in the previous email? Like, how do we know? Maybe you could go into the holy foreskin as well, but how do we know that do we have any that we know for certain came from antiquity? I'm
sure that there are some relics of much later saints that could be verifiable or verifiably from them. Do we have the actual crown of thorns? I'm going to say that's rather highly unlikely. But the point is, again, it's that there is an object around which there is so much interest, around which there are so many stories, right? You mentioned the Shroud of Turin, right? That Shroud of Turin is quite late. I don't think we have any reference to it until something like the middle of the 14th century. But there were plenty of other cloths associated with Jesus that existed long before the Shroud of Turin did. One of the stories that I love is of the image of Edessa. So Edessa is the ancient name of the city of Urfa, which is in southeastern Turkey. It was actually decimated by the recent earthquake. But the story goes something like this. Eusebius, who's the great church historian of the 4th century, tells the story of a king by the name of Abgar in the 1st century who was suffering from some incurable illness, unclear what it was. And he writes a letter to Jesus. And according to the story, Jesus gets the letter, and reads it. And, it says, hey, I hear you're this wonder worker that you can, cure illnesses. Would you consider coming up to Edessa to help me out? Jesus, apparently, according to this story, writes him back, says, no, I can't make it. I've got a lot of things going on down here, but I'll send one of my disciples, right?
Yeah. I just love Jesus, like, like a white button, like collar job. Just like, no, I'm busy. Like, keep going.
Yeah. Itinerary full for this week. Sorry. Yeah. So he, but the story changes over time. Right. So in some versions of the story, Jesus's letter itself becomes this wonder working relic that, gets waved about from the walls of Edessa when the Persians are trying to take the city, and it protects the city from harm. In other versions of the story, it changes all the time. It wasn't a letter that Jesus sent back, but rather it was a portrait of himself, and that this portrait then, saves the city. And then it morphs into, actually an image of him in one sort of final version, that when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and when in the gospel text it says that, he's sweating and it's like blood, like the drops of sweat are falling like blood, that he impresses, the image of his face on a cloth, that he gives it to Thomas, and that Thomas then gives it to Thaddeus, and Thaddeus eventually makes his way with it to Edessa, and that's what heals the king, right? I mean, and there are other stories, for example, the Veil of the Veronica, which was incredibly important in the Middle Ages. But the point of the story is that they're all these convoluted stories that change. Is it a letter? Is it a portrait? Is it, somehow he impressed it on cloth? But that there's this sense of connection with Jesus, and there's this sense that anything that he touched would be some sort of wonder-working relic. And people have heard of the Shroud of Turin, but there are tons of these sweat cloths, they're known as, it's a sudarium, right? Or handkerchiefs. But you hear in Acts, right? In Acts, it says about Paul that even the handkerchiefs or aprons that he touched could then be brought to the sick and it would cure them, right? So there's a biblical precedent here. And back to our whole point that you brought up earlier of, you tell a story, people hear the story, then they expand on that story. Well, here you've got a biblical mention, first of all, of Jesus being wrapped in linen. John's gospel talks about a headcloth that's discarded somewhere. Acts talks about what I just said about, handkerchiefs and aprons being brought to Paul. And so then you tell more stories, and there's just this explosive proliferation of these stories. And the Shroud of Turin is just a Johnny-come-lately to the story. There's so many other stories that existed way before that about these powerful cloths. So,
yeah, what do you think about Ron Wyatt?
Ron Wyatt.
Do you know who that is?
You have to help me out.
He's claimed to. A lot of Christians really stand behind him. He's claimed to find Noah's Ark, the Roman wheels in the Dead Sea. He's the mountain where Jesus sent fire down. I think he found that. But the most interesting one he found is apparently he was this preacher from a church that doesn't really believe in the power of the Holy Spirit as today, and he's walking along in Israel, and he just points and says, this is where Jesus is the Ark of the Covenant is. And this is an amazing story, but they go down into this cave and they find the Ark of the Covenant and they see a crack above it. And if you look up through the crack, they realize that's where there's this black matter that had fallen down. They realize above it is where Jesus was crucified, and it fell down onto the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. And it collapsed. The cave collapsed, and they could no longer find it. But a lot of people believe that this is
That's convenient.
yeah. And it was covered up. But a lot of people really believe that this is a true thing that happened. I'll just try and find but yeah, like he's got, like, they had, apparently he sent blood samples to certain groups in Israel to get it measured, and they said it was both male and female blood, and all this, like, it's very wild. I don't know if I wish I had. You should look into it, because it's not something that is taken very seriously by a lot of Christians today. Like, it's like people, when you see someone make a claim that they found Noah's Ark, they'll say, "Oh no, Ron White found this years ago." Like, this is, and they try to cover it up. It's a conspiracy, and they don't want the world to know about the real Jesus. And he's very convincing. From a like, he's very good the way he presents his ideas, but I think it's definitely all BS. Very convenient, I would say. But I was just wondering if you had a perspective historically of that.
Well,
no. You can't comment. That's okay.
No comment. But something tells me he probably didn't find Noah's Ark.
Okay. I just do want to shout out your kind of stuff. So you've got your University of Toronto information here that people can check out, but you've blogged on twice now on Bart Ehrman's blog as a guest blogger, and that's how I found you, actually. So people, if you subscribe to Bart Ehrman's blog, you can check that out. And of course, you have your book that people can go purchase, and the Amazon link is in the description, so you can just order it. It's fantastic. I really do recommend people check it out. It's a great book. It looks amazing. The artwork is amazing, and the information is so dense. It's worth every penny. If you want to support this channel, you can become a member by clicking the join button here as well. And then you get little badges and custom emojis and some personal updates from myself, and your comments will pop up and I'll make sure I read them. But if you want to become a Patreon member as well, you can see our behind the scenes stuff and our information. And you can also, when I see you come up in the chat, I'll make sure I give special favoritism to the patrons, because you guys are what keep this show afloat. I really appreciate it. It means the world to me. So I did want to ask you, though, as we kind of like not wrap up the interview right now, but like as we kind of getting near the end of the interview, I'd love for you to actually tell me about this holy foreskin. What are you talking about with this?
Yeah, so colleagues of mine have written about this. I'm not going to be able to say a whole lot about it, other than I believe, somebody can easily Google this, but I believe that is also at Notre Dame, the supposed holy foreskin. Would that have been kept for posterity? And would a piece of flesh like that have survived for 2,000 years? Seems a bit unlikely to me, but nevertheless, go ahead.
So wait, is it supposed to be like Jesus or something? Jesus' foreskin? Or
there we go.
Wow. Is it okay?
Yeah.
I never thought that. So
it's ingenious, right? In that, okay, he was bodily resurrected, but wait, there must be some little part of him left behind, because
and it must be it must be that. Oh yeah. Wow. That's incredible. Wow. So do we is that something that burnt up, and do you know if we still actually have it, or like if it's like is it been verified? Is it a first century foreskin, or like?
That seems rather unlikely. I don't know what it is, or if anybody has trotted it out, but I should have read up about that before.
No, that's okay.
But,
it was kind of just
my apologies.
So, another thing that you kind of talk about in your book that I'm excited to dive more into as we get into the later chapters when I finish it. But you mentioned about there's a lot of miracles, right, attributed to martyrs and saints. What is, besides, I mean, there's some interesting stories with the first saint you talk about, Alban, and who he dries up the river, and and then or the not being was it Bartholomew, or it was it was Polycarp who was set on fire, and he's just like okay through it all. By the way, I forgot to read out, when he was dying, is it true that he said, "I bless you, Father, for judging me worthy of this hour, so that in company of the martyrs I may share the cup of Christ"? Is that historical?
I mean, again, we don't. It's hard to say we have eyewitness reports, and that this text is written after the fact. And even if it is even if we can assume, maximally speaking here, that this was being written by an eyewitness, what parts are embellished, what parts are added later, it's extremely difficult for us to say such and such actually happened. On the other hand, we also can't say such and such didn't happen. We just simply don't have the evidence. We have literary stories, and some of those you might say, well, the context makes sense, that we know that this was such and such was going on in the Roman Empire at the time, like it's not out of the question. Yeah, surely people were killed. Surely Christians were killed in antiquity. That's not arguable. But a line by Daniel Boyarin that I'm fond of quoting is, being killed is an event. Martyrdom is a piece of literature. It's a genre, right? And you have to, I think, hold those two things apart. Yes, people may have been killed. Was it like this? Did all of these miracles happen? I mean, that's up to the individual reader to decide. My perspective as a historian is one of extreme skepticism, and I'm not witnessing divine intervention in my everyday life, so that's not something that I bring to my analyses of these texts. Again, though, I don't want to come across as saying none of this is true. To me, that's actually not the most interesting question for me. For me, the most interesting question is, why do we have this proliferation of stories about all of these martyrs, and how does that go about shaping the culture of Christianity in late antiquity and in the Middle Ages, and really up to the present? The persistence of these stories is what's interesting to me.
Yeah, you quote David Eagleman, who says that every human dies 3 deaths. The first, he says, is the obvious one, when the body ceases to function. The second death is when the body is consigned to the grave. And the third is the moment sometime in the future when your name is spoken for the very last time. Of most of the thousands of Christians said to have been martyred in Persia, nothing remains. Yeah, it's profound idea, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I love that from Eagleman, from his book Some, which is a totally fascinating read. But that again gets back to what we were talking about right at the very beginning of this episode, David, about the importance of remembering names and invoking these names of these past heroes, right? If you read that again from Eagleman, right, that third and final death, right? The first one is when your body ceases to function. The second one, when you're buried. And the third one, and this, oh my God, how does this just not rip your heart out? When somebody somewhere says your name for the very last time, right? And then you're totally forgotten. Actually, that's a perfect ending and segue, because that's the conceit of that Disney film, Coco, that Pixar film, right? Is that if you've got this image, this photograph of your relative up on the altar, if you don't, have that person's photograph up there year after year, eventually in the land of the dead, they pass away. They fade away like Marty McFly in the photograph from Back to the Future, right? They die this final death, right? And in fact, I first came across that Eagleman quote. I'd read his book, but I was reminded of it by an article in the New York Times a few years ago by Bill Shapiro, who I think used to be the photography editor of Life magazine, where he used that. And this is somebody, Bill Shapiro, who collects all these old photographs. He goes around to garage sales and like gets all of these other people's photographs, from decades ago. And that again is just totally rips your heart out of like, whose photos are these? Like whose family photos are they? Why were they discarded? And like, these are all photos of people who are decades dead. And am I the last one to ever look at this person, right? The importance of memory. So, the importance of having an annual means of celebrating these saints that's something that persists throughout. That's a thread that goes throughout this book, and the importance of names, the importance of saying their names. It's galling to a lot of these historians who write about the martyrs, and when they talk about, this many people were killed and there was thousands of people killed, and that they can't tell the story of each individual person and give each individual name, but as Paula Fredrickson once put it, it's not as if tens upon tens of thousands of Christians were being killed in late antiquity. Some were, but it wasn't tens upon tens of thousands. But what do you have? You have tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of people reading the stories of the few who were and holding up their memory.
And that is a perfect way to kind of describe your book. When I was doing recently, I was doing research on a family tree, and I remember it's so annoying. McDonald's is such a large clan in Scotland that we go. If I could get to I think 1750 AD, I could trace my lineage back to Somerled of 1150 AD, but I can't. I can get to 1780. Which is when the census starts in Scotland. So I'm missing like 40 years where I could like tie it all together, which is so frustrating. But one of the things that that I found really profound when I was looking into this is I was looking into the census dates of some of my family, my great grandfather or whatever. And it's like his name is written in handwriting on a census form and the date, and that's it. That's all that's remains of him. Like, or his wife. It's like nothing else is known about that person, whether he was a good man, a bad man, whether he was an alcoholic or a priest. We don't know anything. He's just that. All that's left of him is his little bit of handwriting and the date. That's it. And it was like, whoa. And it's like, how many people in history do we have that? How many stories were just never written down? How many, and it was at that stage I started cataloging everything. In fact, every time we have a family gathering now, I stick my phone just on next near the table, and I just record the whole conversation and then upload it privately on YouTube because and now we look back, we got conversations from 5 years ago when Nan was with us, and we can see like a family dinner, and it's like those moments are kind of special, and I think that's your book kind of. You've had some people say no, like I used to post on Twitter that it Too Long Didn't Read, like he didn't like it. Like some Christians have come up against your book and said, no, Christianity is not a cult of the dead. And although it is a title that tries to capture people's attention, what you're not saying it in a negative way. You're saying it in kind of an honoring, respectful, in an honoring way, in like it's steeped in Christianity is steeped in the blood of its martyrs. And that's the whole point. And I guess to end, there's a quote by Candida Moss in Inescapable but Repugnant Conclusion that dying for Christ may be the central rather than peripheral part of the Christian experience. And that's not to say that every Christian needs to become a martyr, but it seems to be what you're kind of getting at is like to be remembered in Christianity. And to kind of like the Christendom as a whole, like as you think of it, is about the martyrdom and the experience of dying as Christ. Is that right? Or can you maybe expand on that as we kind of close up this interview?
Yeah, well, I think Candida's point there was that the martyrs, to borrow from a title of one of her books, are regarded as the other Christs, right? That's the actual title of her book. And if you look at so much of this literature, just as we've talked about, you read from Ignatius's letters, we talked about St. Alban, but this willingness, at least according to these stories, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, recognizing, as Ignatius put it, that that's what it means to be a true disciple. And I think that that's what she was getting at with the quotation that you've just read. Repugnant, perhaps, to many Christians today to think that this is the particular calling, but not repugnant at all if you're operating in the era of late antiquity and you have this understanding of, well, this is what happened to Stephen, this is what happened to the apostles, this is what happened to the people who knew the apostles, that sort of testimony in blood by way of following in the footsteps of Jesus is a simple expectation. It's jarring for us to hear that in 2023. That's not most people's conception of Christianity. But that, as you said, and thank you for saying it, not in a pejorative way, not in a hey, this is stupid sort of way, or hey, this is crazy sort of way, but in a way that what I'm trying to say is, this is amazing. This is really fascinating in terms of the culture of Christianity that is built around the memory of the dead.
And that is exactly what your book is all about. And just to promote it one more time, guys, make sure check the book out. If it sounds interesting to you, this book is amazing, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of Kyle Smith on future episodes of maybe this show and maybe some other shows. I think you need to get out there because your content is truly awesome. And this isn't your first book, by the way. This is your first popular level book, right? Then the other books are more academic in nature.
Yeah, the other books are more academic in nature. If you're up late and you are trying to get to sleep, you should probably read one of those. But this book, very different. I hope it's entertaining. So,
Doorknob had said he disagreed with. He said, "It is true. Christianity is not a cult of the dead. It's cults of the dead."
Fair enough. Yeah.
Fair enough. Dee said, "This is fascinating. Thanks, Kyle. This really was fascinating. Thank you so much, and thank you for introducing me to this. I'm very surprised by this. By the way, I'm very surprised. I think I'm going to go out there and make my wife take a little bite of it. It's an interesting flavor. I'll say that much. And Kyle, thank you so much. You can follow Kyle on Twitter, links in the description, as well as checking out his book. And we'll leave this episode with a trailer for the Purity Culture panel that is coming up in April. We will be announcing the guests in the next couple of weeks, the panelists in the next couple of weeks. But thanks, guys. I'll see you later. Bye.
Thanks, David.